I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background to this work, a bit about our obsession with technological capitalism or the sharing economy. I'll get into detail with that in a bit. I'll talk about why we should care about technology and refugees, why that matters now in particular, and I'll then go into depth a little bit with what urban technologies are and what I mean with that, and how that potentially challenges and how these technologies potentially challenge the ways of seeing and ways of knowing cities. I then have some research questions and the theoretical basis and the methodology for my work, and we can then talk about so what, and if you guys have any questions on that front. So broadly speaking, when I say our obsession with technological capitalism, I mean there's been a lot of language surrounding the use of technology for solving fundamentally social and political issues. If you look at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Innovation Service website, you'll find that they find that the problem of refugees is fundamentally about self-reliance, right? And one of the things that they identify as a solution to the problem of self-reliance is necessarily market-based, necessarily technological solutions. And you'll find this language in a lot of places. You find them at governmental agencies, you find them in governments broadly, you find them at the local level where entrepreneurs in the city are trying to help solve the refugee crisis in each in their own different ways. You've probably heard of a lot of these technologies coming out of camps specifically, where they're used for connectivity, but increasingly these apps are also emerging within the city as gateways to integration. So this is just some of the language that's used around this. And there are earlier iterations of the same kinds of technologies. They're used within the literature and the narratives on information communications technologies for development, information communications technologies for human rights. They all sort of fall under the same umbrella broadly. Let me give you a little bit of background to why I find this interesting. I think in the digital era, there's been a lot of focus on sort of the democratizing and the empowerment affordances of social technologies, of urban technologies, of the sharing economy. And I think this has been, while this has been subject to a lot of elation and a lot of excitement, especially in their ability to challenge inequality and their ability to speak truth to power. We've seen a lot of narratives, articles, books written on technology and their affordances for spurring the Arab Spring. We haven't talked as much about to what extent they may perpetuate or just displace, but still reinforce some of the existing inequalities that exist in society when we're talking about who can speak and who is heard, when we're talking about who has access and who gets to have access using technologies. And so I think we've landed ourselves in a bit of a predicament in our fetishization of sort of smart technologies for countering inequality without even speaking politically about what it means that there is an inequality. So there are many ways in the academic literature to understand urban technologies. There's an understanding within information communications technologies for development and modernization theory, and that speaks to sort of, to give you a very, very rough, very broad idea of what that means, that speaks to sort of how modernization theory was deployed under development practice in the second half of the 20th century as an understanding of if you just inject enough capital into a developing country, that you can get them to the takeoff stage, at which point they'll then develop, whatever that means. Of course, that has an undercurrent of a certain kind of colonial narrative. It has an undercurrent of a lineal path to development. And the same kind of narrative is used when we think about technology, right? Because in a lot of cases, you're like, okay, so this country is experiencing X, Y, Z problems. There are problems of poverty. There are problems of inequality. There are problems of democratization. And so we'll just inject a bit of technology into it, and hopefully we'll get to a better place. So that's the IC4D and modernization theory. I won't get into the depths of the many other discourses around this, but for a brief overview, you guys will be aware that there's a lot of talk about big data and AI, and to what extent artificial intelligence may also perpetuate inequalities. These, again, also speak to the ways in which apps, again, urban technologies, might play a role into that. But let's leave that for now. My background into this is drawing the linkages between political sociology and critical urban studies and then bringing the gap that I've seen in migration studies to sort of a fulfillment through critical urban studies and political sociology. Specifically, I find that in migration study, there's been a lot of focus on how technology has been used sort of either at the border for the interception of migrants or between borders, sort of for connectivity again, but not a lot has been focused on the ways in which technologies may be a mundane form of social exclusion within a sort of a border, within the state. And so that's really where my interest is placed. So let's talk a little bit about what urban or social technologies are. In a nutshell, in my conception, is sort of digital technologies that purport to integrate or incorporate people into the city. You might know some of the most sort of used ones as Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Instacart, HomeAway, Deliveroo. But there are also derivatives of these particular technologies that are catered towards refugees and asylum seekers. Some of these are known as Workia, which is a sort of a job matching service based in Berlin. It matches refugees with low-paying but nevertheless available jobs. Refugees Welcome is another one that is sort of a microfinance-based room sharing initiative, also based out of Berlin. Taranu is interesting because it uses blockchain to create a digital identity for refugees because as we know, a lot of the time they come in without papers, and so this technology essentially creates a rating system upon which you are given a digital technology, and the better you're rated by your peers, the more credible you are, and therefore you might have access to, say, financial inclusion. And that's just an overview of what these technologies do. But what happens when these technologies start targeting vulnerable populations without thinking about what this means for long-term stability, without thinking about necessarily including the subjective perceptions of the users of those technologies, for example, in terms of whether this perpetuates a certain sense of precarity or not. So there are implications for the crucial distinction between entering a city and seeing it via, for example, a diaspora community who may extend access to knowledge about where you might go for work or where you might go for housing, or even help you, say, if your neighbor within the said diaspora community is your landlord and you can't pay rent that month, there might be a certain element of lenience that can be gained through bargaining with that neighbor. And that sort of subjective, very place-based, very organic relationship and knowledge spillover is important. And I think there's a crucial distinction there between accessing the city in that way and then accessing a city where you come in and you have a host of technologies available to you. And I've tried to sort of, I've got a scattery head, and so I've tried to create a diagram here for what I mean with that. So we've got the subject here, the newcomer, and the city that they might see through the diaspora is fundamentally different than the city they might see by using urban technologies. Urban technologies are routinized. They're based on, especially when they come out of larger sort of corporations, they're usually based on a normalized, very objective sort of point of view of the city that doesn't take into account those subjective, sort of very cultural, sometimes under the radar ways of conducting yourself within the city. So what kind of distinct geographies might emerge through the virtually mediated city? So if you are only seeing the city through these technologies, are there potentially flexibilizing elements of that? What if the ways of accessing work is always one that is based on finding jobs on a sort of a weekly basis or even daily basis, but you don't know whether there's a job waiting for you the following week? What if the ways of accessing housing is based on a microfinance scheme where you don't pay anything up front, there's no collateral involved, but the interest rate at which you pay later on is absolutely exorbitant, or you might end up in a situation in which you are kicked out of a room without any particular notice and then end up having to use said sort of microfinance initiative again to access housing. So again, the kind of geographies that emerge through the virtually mediated are potentially precarious, and I want us to think about that a little bit more. And what implications does this have generally, at a broader question level, for how and whether refugees and asylum seekers can access socioeconomic provisions. In the neo-Marxist literature, if there are any neo-Marxists out here or readers of neo-Marxism, there is this conception of the right to the city and who has the right to the city. But in the face of the datafied city, in the face of a city that's crucially only access to urban technologies, who has the right to the city? And does that mean that the only access that refugees and asylum seekers get is fundamentally to this virtually mediated superficial city? So I think there are problems there with how urban technologies may be used as a method for modulating access to welfare. And that's just something for me, that's a research interest, but I think that has really profound ethical implications for how we may or may not want to advocate technologies like this in the future, or to what extent we might want to take a step back and regulate. My broader research question in this research is, do urban technologies reinforce inequality in refugees and asylum seekers? And I've broken this down into 4 different questions that I intend to answer by doing ethnographic work over the next year. Firstly, what is the subjective experiences of precarity in relation to the city in cases where you use technology to access the city, and in cases in which you are techno-agnostic in the way that you access the city? So that's not to say that you never use an urban technology, but that is to say that fundamentally your fallback option and the way that you are plugged in to the city is based on a sort of a local diaspora community first. How do people's understanding of power and technology vary in these different cases? What conditions matter for how people are skeptical about technology? And might skepticism in the way that technologies are created for incorporation lead to better, more resistive technologies? So I also think that there's a sort of a gap in the way that we don't really make a distinction between technologies of control and technologies of resistance. And then finally, how do newcomers themselves use ICTs or different unconventional technologies to incorporate? So oftentimes when we think about technologies, we think about the digital, we think about smart tech, we think about things that's accessed through your phone. But what about technologies that aren't about something that's datafied, that aren't about something that's based on your phone? What about technology as a hotline that you can call if you're detained by the police to get access to, say, the nearest paralegal to you who can come and represent you and ensure that you aren't jailed for some crime that you didn't commit? What if that set technology is based on simply gatherings at local churches where you talk about VPN, or where you talk about simply just even mundane things such as sort of wake work, and what's often referred to as talking about the psychological dimensions of being targets of, say, police brutality or being targets of racial profiling. These can be seen as technologies as well, and technologies of incorporations and technologies of resistance, but they're not based on the digital. Right. So the theoretical basis, I won't go too into it, but fundamentally, I think there are sort of several important points to this. First, there's a sort of postmodernist view on this, so drawing on governmentality, and then also there is this element of socio-technical imaginaries, and I'll explain what that means very shortly. So ideas that we have as a group within certain contexts about what technology can do is fundamentally how we think about what socio-technical imaginaries are. And I think there's a very distinct socio-technical imaginary within agencies such as the UNHCR's Innovation Service and within governments that aren't in sync with how people who are using these technologies themselves, or people who are trying to integrate or trying to incorporate or survive themselves, are experiencing the city. And so what does it mean for these two to be out of sync with one another? And how can we think of better ways in bridging those gaps, or do we even want to do that? And then again, I keep using this term precarity because I think the epistemological standpoint of subjects of research are often neglected in the way that we tend to sort of interpret without including the other in our work. And I think sort of subjective perceptions of precarity in relation to technology and including that is a really important way of countering some of these hegemonic narratives. Right. So I talked a little bit about before, like the differences between accessing socioeconomic provisions in the city by using urban technologies and by using a diaspora community. And I think the distinction there is made crucially through your ability to activate or not activate your face and body as a bargaining mechanism. And I refer to this as face capital. It's really the ability for you to literally use your face and body to go to the local council and ask for financial support. It's about you going to your landlord and asking for lenience in terms of paying rent later. It's about accessing the black market. It's about accessing informality in different ways that are, again, predicated upon, in context of absolute marginality, what is the last form of political capital that you have? And I think that's the face and body. And what are the implications for eroding that completely through routinized technologies that don't allow you to have that kind of conversation, that don't allow you to have that kind of bargaining power? And we can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A if you guys are interested. Of course, some have argued that technologies create a more egalitarian space in which everyone's treated equally, and that the fact that there isn't space for this is a good thing. But when fundamentally people at the margin have relied on this very mechanism to survive for centuries, you have to stop and wonder whether egalitarianism in this case is to be prioritized above that face capital. So I've mentioned already that this is mostly based on ethnography. I'll also be conducting some elite interviews with government agencies and with the UNHCRs, hoping to understand whether this idea of technology-based, market-based solutions being the way forward with refugees is sort of a widespread understanding, and whether this is something that's shared or lobbied by technology corporations, or whether there's something that I'm fundamentally misunderstanding about these initiatives, which could very much be the case as well. I'll be doing some of my work in diaspora communities in Brooklyn, Crown Heights, Jackson Heights, and Red Hook, or just some of these, and in Berlin, where we know since 2015 there's been a lot of asylum seekers, and there's also been a deluge of technologies of this sort that have been spreading out. I've already asked this question, so I think we'll leave it at this question. Broadly speaking, what does it mean that refuge and the refugee is datafied? And how is placelessness exploited in technological capitalism? And what does that mean for other citizens as well in future? The way that you access Uber, the way that you access Airbnb in Germany, in the UK, in Brazil, in America are very much the same. And so the ideal form of labor to feed into these forms of employment are necessarily placeless, right? Because the technologies themselves are placeless. And what does this mean about, what does this say about the kind of direction in which we're headed in general when we're talking about employment relations and when we're talking about accessing work and housing beyond the refugee question as well? Yep, thank you.